There are nights when a person lies still in the dark. The city lights leak through the window. Everything outside feels calm, yet inside, there's a faint sound. A quiet whisper that never stops. Why is it that even when we have money, friends, even success, we still feel empty? Why can't our hearts rest? Augustine asked that question more than 1600 years ago, and somehow it's still ours today. He was born in the burning heat of North Africa, into a family divided between two worlds. His father, proud and ambitious, believed a man's worth was measured by power and status. His mother, gentle and faithful, believed a soul's worth was found in forgiveness and grace. Between those two forces, Augustine grew up sharp, curious, hungry for knowledge, yet already sensing that knowledge alone could never heal the human heart. Like so many young people today, he wanted to be understood, to be loved, to be seen. He read endlessly, argued passionately, chased truth in every direction. But the more he tried to prove himself, the lonelier he became. Behind his confident eyes was a soul afraid of emptiness, afraid that life might mean nothing at all. He once wrote, "I searched for you outside, in the stars, in fame, in wisdom, not knowing that you were already within me." It sounds like confession, but really, it's a cry for help. Because sometimes to find peace, a person must first walk through every storm they've created. The story of Augustine isn't just the story of a saint. It's the story of every restless heart, every human being who has ever questioned, wandered, or longed for meaning in the middle of the night. His journey reminds us that success without peace is still a kind of poverty, and that silence, when we dare to face it, can become the doorway to grace. And maybe that's why his words still echo across centuries. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you. Augustine often said that childhood is where the soul first learns its language. Not the words we speak, but the secret habits of the heart. He remembered his own boyhood not with pride, but with a kind of ache, as if every small memory carried a lesson that took a lifetime to understand. He was born in a small town near the edge of the Roman Empire, where the streets smelled of dust and salt from the sea. His mother, Monica, taught him to pray before he even knew what meant. His father, Patricius, pushed him toward success, proud whenever his son outshined others in school. Between them, Augustine learned two worlds, the quiet faith of his mother and the fiery ambition of his father. He wanted both, though he understood neither. As a boy, he was bright, eager, and full of mischief. He loved the thrill of being praised and feared the shame of being wrong. But the story that haunted him all his life was a single, simple act. One that, on the surface, meant nothing at all. One night, with a group of friends, he crept into a neighbor's orchard. The moon was full, the air warm. They laughed, whispered, and shook the branches of a pear tree heavy with fruit. The pears weren't special, small, not even ripe, but they stole them anyway. They didn't eat them. They threw them to the pigs. Years later, Augustine would write, "I stole those pears not because I was hungry, but because I delighted in doing wrong." He realized that night wasn't about fruit at all. It was about the strange joy of rebellion, the sweet taste of freedom mixed with guilt. Every human being, at some point, feels that same pull, doing something not for gain, but simply because we can. That's what makes the story timeless. The stolen pears are every impulsive choice we've ever made, every moment we chose thrill over truth, ego over empathy. Augustine saw it for what it was. The first whisper of pride, the beginning of the long road away from innocence. He didn't write that memory to shame himself, but to understand himself. To face the truth that even a child, untouched by the world's cruelty, can still carry a shadow within. "I loved the companionship of those who sinned with me," he wrote. "Together we laughed, and together we were lost. When he looked back, he saw that behind every sin there was a longing, a desire not for evil, but for belonging. We want to be seen, to be accepted, to feel alive. But when love is absent, we reach for the thrill of transgression. And in that, Augustine saw the shape of every broken heart. The story of the stolen pears is small, but it contains the seed of everything to come. It's where guilt meets grace, where the boy who laughed under the moon would one day cry before God, whispering, "You were with me even then, but I was not with you." And maybe that's why we still remember him. Because in his story, we find our own. When Augustine left his small hometown and arrived in Carthage, it felt like stepping into another world. The city was alive, music from the taverns, voices in the markets, laughter echoing through marble streets that never seemed to sleep. Carthage was the heart of Roman Africa, where ambition burned hotter than the desert sun, and Augustine, young and brilliant, was ready to set the world on fire. He was 19, full of dreams and arrogance, a student of rhetoric, the art of winning arguments, of turning truth into applause. Words were his weapon. And in Carthage, words meant power. The louder you spoke, the more they listened. The smarter you sounded, the more they adored you. Augustine loved that feeling, the rush of being noticed, the warmth of being praised. But underneath it all, he was chasing something deeper, something he couldn't name. He wrote later, "I came to Carthage, and I found myself surrounded by a cauldron of lust." And it was true. The city pulsed with desire, not just for sex, but for beauty, status, attention, for the taste of being alive in a world that promised everything. In Carthage, pleasure was an art, and every soul was an artist trying not to drown in it. Augustine fell in love for the first time there. She was nameless in his writings, but unforgettable in his heart. A woman of warmth and wit who saw through his pride and loved him anyway. Together they shared 10 years and a child, a Diodatus, the gift of God. But love in Carthage was complicated. It was a city that taught passion without permanence, desire without devotion. And though he loved her deeply, he loved the idea of success even more. At night, after teaching his students and debating philosophy, he would walk home through the narrow alleys, hearing the sounds of music and shouting behind closed doors. There was always something burning: oil lamps, hearts, ambitions. Sometimes he'd stop by the water and watch the reflection of the moon ripple in the harbor. He'd whisper to himself, "Is this all there is?" But the next morning, he would wake and chase applause again. He tried to fill the silence inside him with every noise Carthage had to offer. Theater, laughter, wine, intimacy, reputation. But no matter how loud the world became, the quiet inside him kept growing. He described it later as a hunger that no food could satisfy, a thirst that no pleasure could quench. Still, Augustine was not evil. He was human. He was a young man trying to find meaning in the only ways he knew. He wanted to love and to be loved, to rise above mediocrity, to be someone that mattered. Isn't that what we all want? We mistake intensity for purpose and passion for peace. But desire, unanchored, always turns into fire. Carthage gave him everything he thought he wanted, and in doing so, showed him everything he lacked. The city taught him how easily brilliance can become vanity, and how quickly love can turn into chains. Years later, he would look back and write, "I became to myself a land of drought." That was Carthage. A place that promised the world and left him empty-handed. A city that gave him pleasure but stole his peace. And it was there, in the heat of its temptations, that Augustine's real story began, not as a saint, but as a man learning that every desire, no matter how beautiful, eventually demands to be answered by something greater than itself. In Carthage, Augustine found love, not the holy kind he would later preach about, but the kind that burns, the kind that makes you forget who you wanted to be. She was never named in his writings, but her presence haunted every word he ever wrote about desire, about loss, about grace. To him she was real, alive, and human. To history, she is only the woman he loved for 10 years. She wasn't a noble woman or a scholar. She was someone who listened, who understood him, when the world only wanted to debate him. When they first met, he was proud, brilliant, already famous among students. She saw through all that. She didn't care about his words. She cared about the silence between them. The part of Augustine that still belonged to a boy searching for love. They built a life together in secret. Not a marriage, but something that felt like home. They laughed, they argued. They shared long nights when the city outside wouldn't sleep. In her arms, Augustine forgot his ambition. He said later, "I loved her, and she loved me. Yet the chain of custom bound me tighter than any iron." In that confession lies the truth. He loved her, but not bravely. Then came their child, a Diodates, the gift of God. For a man who thought he could define truth, this child became the truth itself. When Augustine held his son, he wrote that his heart trembled. For the first time he understood what unconditional love meant. Yet even that love carried guilt. Society called their son illegitimate. Religion called their union sinful. And Augustine, torn between passion and philosophy, carried both love and shame in the same heartbeat. He tried to justify it as natural, human, even beautiful, but deep down, he knew he was building his happiness on shifting sand. The world he lived in praised intellect but condemned affection. A man could boast about victory in debate, but not about tenderness in bed. And so, Augustine hid the part of himself that was most real. Years later, when he finally chose the path of faith, he sent her away. History remembers the day he said goodbye. He wrote, "With a love that could not die." She returned to Africa, vowing never to love another. He stayed in Milan, hollow and silent, writing of God but thinking of her. He said, "My heart, torn from her, was bleeding." It's easy to judge from a distance, to call it sin or weakness. But when you read his words, you feel something deeper. The pain of a man who wanted to be whole, but didn't know how. Love had given him joy and guilt in equal measure, and both would shape the man he became. Perhaps that's the most human thing about Augustine. He wasn't born. He was a man who loved deeply, imperfectly, and lost everything before he learned that real love, the kind that endures, is never about possession. It's about surrender. After years in Carthage, Augustine began to feel something shift inside him. The city that once made him feel alive now left him restless. Fame had lost its sweetness. Desire had lost its thrill. He had tasted everything the world offered, and still, there was a hollow space inside his chest that no applause could fill. So, he turned where all clever men eventually turn, to philosophy. He wanted truth, not rumors of it. He devoured every idea he could find, chasing it like a starving man chasing light. He studied Cicero, whose words first sparked in him a hunger for wisdom beyond pleasure. He read Aristotle, the Stoics, the Manichaeans, a group that promised him answers to the oldest question in the world: why does evil exist? To a mind as sharp as Augustine's, their logic was seductive. The Manichaeans claimed that good and evil were two eternal forces locked in battle, that human beings were victims of cosmic war. To them, sin was not choice but destiny. And for a while, Augustine found comfort in that. It meant he wasn't guilty, just trapped. But deep down, he knew something didn't fit. If evil was an equal power to good, then where was freedom? Where was responsibility? He spent 9 years defending those beliefs, arguing with anyone who questioned them, proud of being the smartest in the room. But the smarter he became, the emptier he felt. He wrote, "I loved truth, but I loved it only when it pleased me." That's the tragedy of intelligence without humility. It can win arguments, but it cannot heal the soul. He began to notice how theory could not comfort pain. When his friend died, no philosophy eased the grief. When he hurt someone he loved, no doctrine could forgive him. The ideas that once felt like wings started to feel like chains. He could describe the universe, but he couldn't describe peace. In his search, he met men who worshipped reason but feared vulnerability. They could quote Plato but couldn't face their own hearts. Augustine saw himself in them. He was brilliant, admired, and spiritually starving. He called it a sickness of pride. In his words, I became to myself a great question. And perhaps that's where the real turning point began. Not in new knowledge, but in the failure of knowledge. Because the moment intellect admits its own limits, the heart begins to listen. Augustine started to sense that truth wasn't something to be argued, but something to be received. Not a system, but a person. He began to hear whispers about a preacher in Milan named Ambrose, a man who spoke of Scripture not as rules, but as living fire. Augustine didn't believe it yet, but something in him stirred. For the first time, he wanted not to win, but to understand. When he looked back later, he said, philosophy was both his teacher and his test. It taught him how to think, and it taught him that thinking alone is not enough. It gave him words for his emptiness, but no remedy for it. He learned that the mind can explore the stars, yet still be lost within itself. And so the philosopher began to doubt philosophy. The brilliant student began to feel foolish. And in that quiet humiliation, a door opened, not to more knowledge, but to grace. Because sometimes, it takes a lifetime of thinking to realize that the truth we chase was never hiding in the sky or in the books, but quietly waiting inside the human heart. When Augustine boarded the ship to Rome, he told himself he was chasing opportunity. In truth, he was running away from the noise of Carthage, from his mother's prayers, from the quiet ache of his own heart. He believed a new city could change his soul, but the problem with running is that you always bring yourself along. Rome dazzled him at first. It was the center of the empire, the city of power. He walked through marble streets and felt the weight of history beneath his feet. Here, ambition wasn't a sin, it was survival. He found work as a teacher of rhetoric, surrounded by students who worshipped wit and charm. And for a moment, he felt alive again. But Rome, beneath the glitter, was colder than he expected. The students cheated him. The city's elite used him. The people smiled at his words, but no one cared about his soul. He began to see that the same hunger followed him. Wherever he went, a hunger for meaning, not applause. The noise of Carthage had turned into the silence of Rome, and both left him empty. Then came Milan, another escape, another promise of a new beginning. He was 29, respected, admired, and exhausted. His reputation as a brilliant orator reached the ears of the governor, who offered him a prestigious position. Outwardly, Augustine had everything he had ever wanted. But inside, he was falling apart. Milan was beautiful, colder in climate but somehow warmer in spirit. It was there that his mother, Monica, caught up with him. She had prayed and followed him across the sea. The God himself would not let her son be lost forever. Augustine was angry at first. He didn't want her faith, her tears, her simplicity. Yet deep down, he envied her peace. He began attending sermons by a bishop named Ambrose, not out of devotion, but out of curiosity. Ambrose spoke with the same mastery of language Augustine admired, but his words carried something else, compassion. He explained Scripture in a way that wasn't about fear or rules, but about truth and mercy. For the first time, Augustine saw intelligence and faith living in the same man. Still, he hesitated. He said, I wanted to follow God, but not yet. That is the confession of almost every restless soul. We want healing, but on our own terms. Rome had given him ambition. Carthage had given him desire. Milan would give him silence, the silence that forces a man to face himself. He began to see that every city he had fled to was just another reflection of his own heart, crowded, noisy, full of distractions. The real escape he needed wasn't a voyage across the sea, but a surrender within. And so, in the middle of his success, Augustine began to fail beautifully. Because sometimes, the failure to escape is the beginning of being found. In Milan, two lights began to rise in Augustine's life. One from heaven and one from home. One spoke with reason, the other with tears. One was the voice of intellect, the other of love, and between them, Augustine's restless heart began to soften. He met Bishop Ambrose first. To Augustine, Ambrose was unlike any man he had ever known. He was calm, eloquent, and powerful, but not in the way politicians were powerful. His strength was quiet, rooted in conviction. When Ambrose spoke, the words didn't just explain scripture, they made it breathe. Augustine came for the language, but stayed for the meaning. He remembered sitting in the crowded cathedral, surrounded by people praying in silence. He didn't understand their faith, but he envied it. He saw in Ambrose something he had never seen in any philosopher: intelligence with humility. Ambrose didn't try to impress, he tried to heal, and that touched Augustine more deeply than any argument ever could. There was a warmth in the bishop's eyes, a fatherly patience that disarmed him. Ambrose didn't lecture him about his sins, didn't mock his doubts. Instead, he listened. When Augustine came to him full of questions, Ambrose would simply smile and say, "Truth is patient. Let it find you." Those words followed him home every night. But home was not quiet either. Monica had finally caught up with her son, the son she had prayed for through storms, tears, and years. The moment she saw him in Milan, she fell to her knees in gratitude. For her, it was not a city of power, it was holy ground. Her boy, the one she thought she lost, was within reach again. She moved into his house, and every morning, Augustine would hear her whisper prayers before the sun rose. Sometimes he would sigh, roll over, and bury his face in the pillow, pretending not to care. But he heard her voice, soft and unwavering, and it worked on him like water over stone. Monica's love was not the kind that shouted. It was steady, stubborn, unbreakable. She had watched her son chase every pleasure, every idea, every promise of happiness, and still, she believed he would find his way home. A mother's tears, Ambrose once told Augustine, can reach where even words cannot. Those two forces, the bishop's reason and the mother's prayer, began to reshape him. Ambrose opened his mind. Monica touched his heart, and somewhere between the two, something divine began to stir. There were days when Augustine would visit Ambrose in his study. He'd see the bishop reading silently, something unheard of at the time. No lips moving, no sound, just stillness. That image stayed with Augustine, a man of words who had learned to listen. It was then he realized that silence could speak louder than speech, but still, the battle raged inside him. His intellect admired Ambrose, but his body longed for the life he left behind. He wrote, "I was drawn in both directions, torn between the call of purity and the weight of habit. It was the war between who he was and who he wanted to be." Monica saw the struggle, but she never forced him. She believed grace had its own timing. "You are not far now," she told him once, her hand on his cheek. He didn't answer, but tears burned behind his eyes. And she was right. He was closer than he knew. The man who once mocked faith now began to crave it. He found himself lingering longer after Ambrose's sermons, his heart strangely moved. The logic that once ruled him began to surrender to something softer love. Two lights guided him through the fog: the wisdom of Ambrose and the faith of Monica. One showed him the mind of God, the other showed him the heart of God. And for the first time, Augustine stopped running. He didn't yet believe, but he had started to listen. And when a restless heart begins to listen, heaven starts to whisper back. It happened on a warm afternoon in Milan. The sky was soft gray, the air still, like the world itself was holding its breath. Augustine had spent the morning fighting with himself, pacing, sweating, praying, cursing, reasoning, breaking apart inside. He was 31 years old, brilliant, admired, successful, and completely exhausted. For years he had chased every kind of pleasure, every kind of truth, and found nothing that could quiet the noise inside him. That day, the noise turned into a scream. He had been talking with a friend, Alypius, about the life he wanted to live versus the life he was living. Tomorrow, he said, I will change tomorrow. But even as he spoke, he felt the lie in his own voice. Tomorrow had been his excuse for years. Lord, make me pure, he once prayed, but not yet. Now the words burned in his throat. Unable to take it anymore, he rushed out into the garden behind the house. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, painting shifting patterns on the ground. He felt the weight of the world pressing on his chest, every choice, every sin, every contradiction inside him demanding to be answered. He fell to the ground under a fig tree and began to cry, not quiet tears, but deep, guttural sobs, the kind that come from the soul's breaking point. He said later, I was weeping in the bitter agony of my heart, and suddenly I heard a voice, as if from a nearby house, a child's voice, chanting over and over, take and read, take and read. Froze. The sound was so gentle, so strange, that for a moment he wondered if he had imagined it. But the words wouldn't stop echoing. Take and read. Wiping his tears, he looked around. Nearby was a small book, the scriptures, the same one he had been avoiding for months. He opened it at random, not knowing what he would find, and his eyes fell on a passage from Paul's letter to the Romans, not in drunkenness and debauchery, not in jealousy but put on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision for the flesh. The words hit him like lightning. He said, it was as if a light of certainty flooded my heart, and all the darkness of doubt vanished away. For years he had searched for truth in arguments, philosophies, and pleasures. Now it came to him in a single line, not as logic, but as love. He didn't need more reasoning. He needed surrender. Augustine stood up, trembling. He walked back inside, his face wet with tears, his chest strangely light. Alypius, seeing him, asked what had happened. Augustine handed him the book and simply said, it is done. The war inside him was over. He had lost, and in losing, he was finally free. That moment in the garden would become one of the most famous conversions in history. But it didn't happen in a church or a temple. It happened in the dirt, under a tree, in the private collapse of a man who had run out of excuses. That's what makes it real. He wasn't trying to be holy. He was trying to breathe. When people read his story, they sometimes imagine a miracle, a voice from heaven, a divine revelation. But the truth is simpler. It was a whisper to a man who was finally quiet enough to hear. Augustine's transformation wasn't a burst of fire. It was a quiet sunrise, the kind that changes everything without making a sound. He returned to his mother that evening. Monica saw his face and knew. She didn't ask. She simply wept and thanked God. After decades of praying, she had watched her son die to his pride and come back to life in grace. Later, Augustine would write, you called, you shouted, and you broke through my deafness. You flashed, you shone, and you dispelled my blindness. I tasted you, and now I hunger and thirst for more. That garden in Milan was the place where intellect bowed to love, where rebellion turned into peace. It was the moment the restless heart found its home. And perhaps that is why his story still speaks to us today. Because every one of us, at some point, finds ourselves in that same garden, wrestling with our own contradictions, wanting to change but afraid to let go. We wait for a sign, a miracle, a voice. And maybe, just maybe, it's already there, whispering softly to every restless soul, take and read. The garden changed everything. In the days that followed, Augustine's heart was calmer than it had ever been. The war inside him was over. He no longer chased applause, pleasure, or debate. My heart was full of a new sweetness. Every chain fell away, and I could finally breathe. In the spring of 387 during Easter, Augustine stood before Bishop Ambrose in the great church of Milan. The building glowed with candlelight. Voices echoed in hymns that rose like waves. Beside him stood his son, Adeodatus, the boy born of forbidden love, now his companion in redemption. Together, father and son stepped forward to be baptized. Ambrose raised the water, his voice steady, and poured it gently over Augustine's head. The crowd fell silent. For a man who had once lived only for the body, the water now felt like light, washing, cleansing, freeing. When Augustine looked up, tears blurred his eyes. He saw his mother in the crowd, her face shining, her lips trembling in prayer. It was the moment she had waited for her entire life. Monica's joy was quiet but deep. She told her friends, "This is all I ever wanted, to see my son alive in God." That night, she and Augustine sat together, watching the sunset over the city. The air was warm, the sky painted in gold and violet. For the first time, they spoke not as mother and son, but as two souls at peace. She said, "There is nothing left for me to desire in this life." He took her hand, not wanting to believe what she meant. Days later, she fell ill. At the port of Ostia, waiting to sail home to Africa, she grew weaker with every passing hour. Augustine stayed by her side, holding her hand, whispering psalms as the sea wind drifted through the window. One evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon, she looked at him and smiled. "My son," she said softly, "bury me anywhere. It does not matter. Only remember me at the altar of the Lord." And then she closed her eyes. Augustine wrote, "When she died, I could not speak. My tears were my prayers." He didn't scream or collapse. He sat in silence, feeling both grief and gratitude. Grief for the woman who had never stopped believing in him, and gratitude for the faith that had finally made her rest. They buried her there in Ostia, far from home. He returned to the house that now felt empty, but he said he could still hear her voice in his heart, as if she had never really left. Her love did not die, he wrote. It only changed its address. In the months that followed, he devoted himself to reflection and prayer. He wrote about memory, how it holds not only what we have seen, but what we have loved and lost. He called it a vast palace of the soul, where even death cannot erase the echoes of love. Augustine now understood what his mother had always known, that the heart is not healed by time, but by meaning. And the meaning of his life had changed. He no longer sought to be admired. He sought to remember, to serve, to love. From that point on, every word he wrote carried her presence. Every prayer bore her name. The boy who once stole pears now carried the memory of a mother who never stopped praying for him. And perhaps that is how grace works. It begins as a whisper, then becomes a wave that outlives us. For Monica and Augustine, love did not end in death. It simply found a new way to speak, through memory, through faith, through the silence that follows every goodbye. Years passed, and Augustine no longer chased the applause of men. He became a teacher of souls instead of speech. The restless fire that once drove him outward had turned inward, burning quietly as reflection now. When he spoke not to impress but to understand. When he prayed, he didn't beg for answers, he listened. The man who once feared silence now lived inside it. After his mother's death, Augustine wrote one of the most intimate and profound parts of his Confessions, his meditation on memory and time. For him, memory was not just a record of the past. It was a living ocean, where love and loss never disappeared, only changed form. I entered into the fields of my memory, he wrote, and there I found all that I am. He described memory as a vast palace filled with rooms and corridors where every sight, sound, word, and feeling waited quietly. There were rooms of joy where laughter echoed like sunlight. There were dark chambers of guilt where shame still whispered. And in the deepest hall, he said, there was something beyond recollection, a faint, holy presence, as if God himself dwelled within the architecture of the soul. To Augustine, memory was the bridge between humanity and eternity. It was how we carried love beyond the grave, how we met God not by traveling upward, but inward. He realized that even our longing for God was a kind of remembering, the soul recalling where it came from. That realization changed him. He stopped asking, "Where is God?" and started whispering, "Where have I hidden from him?" Then he turned to the question that still baffles philosophers today, time. What is it? Where does it go? He wrote, "If no one asks me, I know. But if I try to explain, I no longer know." He realized that time doesn't exist outside us. It lives within us. The past survives in memory, the future in expectation, and the present in attention. He said, there are 3 times the present of things past, which is memory, the present of things present, which is perception, and the present of things future, which is expectation. To Augustine, this meant that eternity wasn't far away. It was hidden in every heartbeat, in every conscious moment. Time, he wrote, is a distension of the soul. It stretches us between what we were and what we will be. For a man who once lived trapped in regret and desire, this truth was liberating. The past no longer haunted him. The future no longer frightened him. He began to live fully in the now, not as escape, but as surrender. In that stillness, he discovered something he had been seeking his whole life: rest. He said, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." That single sentence became the heartbeat of his faith. It was more than belief, it was experience. Every temptation, every failure, every love, every loss had led him here, to this quiet understanding that the restless human heart only finds peace when it stops running and finally comes home. Augustine's writings after his conversion are not the words of a perfect man, but of a man who finally made peace with imperfection. He spoke of grace not as a concept, but as a constant rescue, a daily reminder that God's love is bigger than our mistakes. He understood that sin wasn't a stain to be scrubbed away, but a wound to be healed. And healing, he said, take and trust. As an old man, he would sit by the window of his home in Hippo, watching the light move across the walls. He saw time not as something slipping away, but as something carrying him closer to the eternal. He said, "Time is not my enemy anymore. It is my teacher." He had lived long enough to see the city burn, to see friends die, to see his own strength fade. Yet even then, he wrote, "I do not fear the passing of time, because I rest in the one who does not pass." In the end, Augustine's story is not just about faith. It's about being human, about the longing every person carries, the ache for something permanent in a world that keeps changing. His life reminds us that meaning is not found in what we hold on to, but in what we surrender. And maybe that's why, after 16 centuries, his words still speak to us. Because no matter who we are or what we chase, every one of us has felt that same quiet hunger, the longing to be known, to be forgiven, to be home. Augustine found that home not in philosophy, not in fame, not even in love, but in rest. Rest in God. And in that rest, his restless heart finally became still.